Good evening, everybody, and welcome to GeoIntel. My name is Cody Jordan. I should have a pretty good show today regarding all of the latest goings-on in the world as it relates to U.S. involvement in foreign governments. And specifically today we're going to be focusing on Iran's latest revolution that they've been experiencing. So a lot of the foreign involvement that has been speculated to be taking place and sort of pushing that forward. And if I have time for it, I may even get into Venezuela and some of the updates that have been happening there. This is the first podcast that I've done in quite a while, so I'm very backed up on a lot of these issues. Specifically Iran, I've been covering it for, well, not live anyways, but I've been following it and taking notes on it for the last few weeks, and so I just have a ton of note buildup, so I probably won't be giving you a lot of my off-rip opinions on the subject, but I'll be reading a lot of the news stories, sort of giving you a time-by-time table of exactly how it all played out. It started in December, late December, and it has really gotten out of hand, so much so that there may be extreme U.S. involvement in the coming days, and it may even result in a full overthrow of the Iranian government as it has existed since the late 70s. So I guess without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into it and not leave you guys waiting. So, as I said, this all kicked off in December, specifically December 28th. There was a merchants' protest that began and were quiet. The Iranian foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, came out and said that he believed that the initial protests were completely legitimate and that they were even constitutional. The government immediately began talks with everybody that was protesting, not directly, but through certain intermediaries such as their news channels. And then they started to try and persuade the protesters to stop. But they had a lot of qualms with a bunch of different issues, specifically that of the national currency and how poorly it's been performing over the last really decade or more, and it's gotten worse and worse and worse as the years have progressed. The Iranian government came out and tried to offer what would equate to a buyout, but they're so broke at the moment due to sanctions and other matters that they simply didn't have anything to offer the protesters. And there's been a lot of speculation around exactly how this sort of grew and evolved into the extremely violent clashes that I will talk about in just a minute. But I think before I start kind of diving into the day-by-day breakdown, I guess I just want to kind of recap exactly everything that has happened in that region over the last roughly 6 to 7 months, specifically since Trump started his second term. So if you'll recall, not that long ago, we had the strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, Isfahan and Natanz, where we used specific missiles that had never been tested before, that were bunker busters, that were capable of reaching depots of uranium enrichment facilities that were extremely well hidden and fortified in mountainous bunkers. And I thought when this initially happened that there would be an immediate progression on the American and Israeli side. But really what ended up happening is that the American citizenry was so against this that Trump realized the pushback he was getting, and he immediately called off any American or Israeli progression into the matter. And we saw a huge missile exchange between Israel and Iran, so much so that they almost, as far as we know, completely depleted each other's missile stocks. But regardless of that happening, we saw Israel start to take air superiority in Iran. And that happened for reasons that I've covered on other episodes of this show. If you'd like to go back and perhaps watch those, it would give you a bit of an update as to exactly how that happened. But there's been a long-standing American and Israeli policy in the Middle East since the 90s to systematically secure Israel's borders by taking over different Iranian-backed governments in smaller nation states, whether it be Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, to a degree Afghanistan, but that was never really so much part of the equation. And their end goal was to ultimately overthrow Iran, because as we'll talk about here in a little bit, Iran has been heavily involved in funding, you could call them terrorist organizations such as Hezbollah, which have been playing a heavy role, not so much in the recent years because of how much American and Israeli military involvement has depleted those forces, but nevertheless, as recent as just yesterday, there were U.S.-approved Israeli bombing campaigns in Lebanon to directly target Hezbollah. And again, this is Iranian-funded forces which have for decades been trying to systematically and slowly drain Israel of its resources, but with a backer like the United States, they have been completely unable to do so. And I'll just sort of stop giving my opinion on the matter and the history of it, just to sort of delve into exactly what has happened here. So, again, you have these merchant protests that began in late December, and according to Iran's own foreign finance minister, these were small, localized protests that were not violent. He claimed that they were constitutional. And then I started seeing intel reports, which I wish I would have bookmarked when I first started seeing them so that I could have let you know where they were from. But I started seeing early intel reports a few weeks ago that Mossad was reportedly involved in ramping up these protests. We still do not yet know to what degree, or if that is even true. I have every reason to believe it is true, because it is in Israel's interests to see this regime in Iran to be overthrown for their own security and for their further state expansion in the region in the future. But so we'll just, like I said, we'll start from the beginning here. So on January 2nd, Israeli Channel 15 reported that if there is an American or Israeli intervention to support the Iranian people in their protests, it would lead to an overthrow of the regime. So we're seeing right away the Israeli news outlets stating that if we were to get involved in these protests, it could very well lead to a collapse of the Iranian government. And then the same day, January 2nd, Iranian regime forces officially started firing live rounds at regime protesters. So directly after they made this announcement, the people in Iran start getting more and more violent in their protests, and the Iranian government responds by firing live rounds, and from the first 4 or 5 days after these protests started, immediately started killing the protesters. And then there were major cyber attacks against Iran, and multiple government and ministry sites were down, although that did not last long, and they were back up within a matter of days. Then on January 4th, Netanyahu came out and repeated something that he had been repeating, and I'll relate this back to how I sort of began this podcast. Netanyahu said 400 kilograms of enriched material must be removed from Iran. There must be strict, real supervision over all nuclear sites. And this really plays into how Israel's stand, not how, I misspoke there, pardon me. This really plays into Israel's stance that they have had since we bombed the nuclear facilities. So after Israel was able to establish air superiority, they were hoping to continue that campaign. And we don't know exactly what their goals were going to be, whether they wanted to just slowly and systematically deplete all of their military resources, or whether they were going to, in a Venezuela sort of attack, actually try and decapitate the government, which, judging by how they carried out their initial strikes on, like, we had the pager bombings that took out basically all of the Iranian hierarchies, and we also had these precise missile strikes on Iranian government officials that completely decapitated Iran's military hierarchy, so that when this all kicked off and they started lobbing missiles at each other after we had bombed the nuclear facilities, Iran really didn't have a way to respond efficiently and effectively following this. And Israel has continually repeated, since we bombed those facilities and since we stopped giving them the green light to do so, to continue out their attacks, Netanyahu specifically has repeatedly been saying that we need to go back in and get the enriched nuclear material that they still possess, that they still claim they possess, and that Israel claims they possess, in order to, quote-unquote, finish the job. So then Iranian regime force... Oh, sorry, I already covered that part. Israeli war cabinet then met on Thursday. This would have been... or were scheduled to meet last Thursday to discuss Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran. And then Israeli Channel 13 had a report the same day, January 4th, stating that after the Venezuelan operation, Israel is considering the possibility of carrying out a similar operation in Iran. Then January 5th, Iran announces that all Iranians will receive payments equal to 1 million tamans, which equates to approximately $7 per person per month for the next 4 months, to help relieve the economic pressure and resolve some of the economic sentiments that the merchants were initially bringing up when the protests had started. And if me just saying that alone didn't let you already know, I'll perhaps repeat it just to get the point across. $7 per month per person is absolutely nothing. And this really enraged the protesters and caused them to become even more violent, and it caused them to continue to grow the size of their protest after this happened. Now, you can make the case that Iran's government would have potentially paid more if they had the economic ability to do so. A lot of people, I'd been seeing certain Israeli components stating that, well, they can afford to pay their Hezbollah operatives in countries such as Lebanon up to $1,200 per month. Why could they not pay their own people? Well, I think the obvious answer there is that, first of all, with it being such a deadly job, people are going to demand a higher pay rate. And then secondly, there's roughly 90 million people in Iran, whereas there are maybe at most 100,000 Hezbollah operatives. So it's much more economically viable to pay their militant factions a large sum of money when there's so few of them, and it's nearly impossible to up the amount of money that they're paying to their own people. Nevertheless, when they come out with this statement, it completely enraged the protesters. That same day, January 5th, Qatar's Ministry of Foreign Affairs said, quote, "We are in contact with Tehran and Washington and support any dialogue to prevent further escalation, and there is still room for diplomatic and political solutions regarding Iran." Then, January 6th, Kurdistan 24, which is a news outlet, said U.S. Army Delta Force units have reportedly moved into positions along Iraq's borders with Syria and Jordan, and comes amid rising friction between Iraqi government and armed factions aligned with Iran that have refused to lay down their weapons. And this will become slightly more important with some of the updates that I will give you towards the end of this talk here. Then clashes began between merchants and security forces in the Tehran bazaar. Protesters then claimed that Iran's security forces struck Sina Hospital in Tehran, and they did that to capture the wounded and take them for imprisonment. So they were going after the people who were wounded in the protests, people that were easy targets who were in the hospital, and taking them and imprisoning them. The anti-regime protesters then took full control of the first city of Abadan near the border with Iraq. And then the same day in Tehran, after the merchant clash, Tehran's gold market fully closed. Then, January 7th, the commander of the police station in Isranshar and former head of the city's intelligence who was responsible for cracking down on anti-regime tribes in the city, was assassinated in a drive-by shooting. And I would have liked to play this for you on here, but I thought that with this going live on YouTube that it would potentially get it taken down. There was no blood in the video, but nevertheless it was extremely violent. It was essentially a live execution, and I thought that that would be a little too far for YouTube's guidelines. And then Regram Navarum had reported that Iranian protests had increased over the past few days. This is, again, January 7th, with the highest total recorded on January 7th at 7,893 participants. But despite that increase, the number of protesters remains nowhere near 1% of the population. Iranian opposition leader, Crown Prince, and the son of the former Shah of Iran, who was ousted in the mid-70s, Reza Pahlavi, then urged nationwide protests starting January 8th and 9th and stated, quote, "To the Iranian soldiers and security forces currently serving the Islamic regime in Iran, it's time to switch sides and join the people." If I'm not mistaken, he gave this statement directly after talks that were not confirmed but reported between himself and Trump. Trump had then said a few days later that he was in talks with Reza Pahlavi, but that he had not made any decisions on what to do. He still seems to be relatively adamant in his position that he does not aim for regime change in Iran. However, due to Zionist factions in the current Trump administration, Trump himself, other Zionist factors such as Marco Rubio, you could even throw Pete Hegseth in there, and the Israeli government itself, you could argue that they're going to eventually push for regime change regardless. Nevertheless, January 8th, Mer News reported that authorities are not relying on besieged militia forces and are instead deploying IRGC ground forces into major cities, which are primarily tasked with protecting the regime rather than carrying out routine policing duties. Trump then came out in a statement and said that he was going to hit Iran very hard if they started killing rioters. There was then a news article posted by Visegrad, which said that the Iranian anti-regime protesters had stormed the governor's headquarters in Georgian, northern Iran, and set it on fire, along with large numbers of Islamic regime police cars. This is where it really, really starts to ramp up, specifically following the statements by Reza Pahlavi, who, again, is the son of the former Shah of Iran. So decades ago, they had he was called a Shah, but you could go ahead and, for all purposes, claim that he was effectively a United States installed king in Iran. He comes out after discussing this with the president and other forces within the American government, after he gives this statement, stating that he wants the soldiers and security forces to rise up and side with the people protesting. This escalates extremely rapidly, and it becomes far, far more violent, as I'm about to read to you. Rioters then targeted mosques in multiple cities and set fire to them. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi had stated that 350 mosques were burned, and claims that no Iranian would do such a thing, which effectively points to a claim that was not directly made, that there was, without a doubt, foreign involvement here, potentially even foreign actors. I have reason to believe and disbelieve that, which we'll get into here a little bit further in this. Israeli Channel 12 then came out and said that Israel had decided to remain on the sidelines for the protests in Iran for now, allowing the United States to take the lead. The people in Tehran are burning down regime buildings, and then Iran began experiencing a government-induced internet blackout. It was the Iranian government, not any other foreign government, that induced this internet blackout. And they did this, in my estimation, for the very specific reason that they were prepared to go to extreme measures to get these protests to stop. Because I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there was a total of 120 or more cities in which these protests had happened. And as I'm about to talk about here in a minute, in some cities, there were as many as 1 million people who began to uprise in these protests, and they were destroying tons and tons of property, setting all kinds of buildings on fire, carrying out political assassinations. And the Iranian regime, the Iranian government, knew that in order to try and get things back under control, they were going to have to take extreme measures, which they were more than willing to take, and they didn't want the rest of the world to see that. So they cut internet access so much so that I believe only 1% of Iran had access to the internet. Of that 1%, I'm pretty sure the majority of that was made up by Starlink. And even that, as I'll discuss a little bit further, they targeted Starlink eventually as well. On January 9th, Pahlavi, who again is the son of the former Shah, came out in another statement, and he said, quote, "For those who are hesitant, join your fellow citizens on Friday night, January 9th and 8th, January 9th at 8 p.m., which would have been last Friday, and grow crowds even larger, further weakening the regime's ability to suppress you. I also call on field leaders to coordinate so that different groups can converge and become even bigger." Trump over Truth Social then said that over 1 million protesters were recorded in Iran's second largest city, Mashhad, causing regime forces to eventually flee the scene. Local Kurdish sources then reported, and for those who don't know, Kurdistan is a region that is sort of in between a bunch of different territories. It encompasses part of northern Iraq, northern Syria, the eastern parts of Turkey, and even a sliver of Iran as well. And although it's called Kurdistan and the people call themselves Kurdish, it's not an established territory or government. It's effectively a large group of tribal people that exist between these bordering nations. Local Kurdish sources reported that PJAK fighters who are Kurdish, a Kurdish militant group linked to the PKK, are operating inside Iran against government forces. Rerum Novarum then reported that Kurdish sources claimed the majority of those forces who entered into Iran through the Iraqi border in the past few days have been killed in the Ilam province and Kermanshah by IRGC forces. MIT, which is Turkey's national intelligence organization, was tracking the PJAK separatists, who are the Kurdish forces, in Iraq and Iran, and sharing intelligence with the IRGC, which is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. which then explained how they were able to quickly neutralize the Kurdish separatists so quickly. So just to restate what I just said there in a large series of words, Kurdish forces were eliminated effectively the same day that they went into Iran in order to fight against the IRGC. Turkish intelligence services were reporting to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps their whereabouts, and they were able to snuff them out within the exact same day that they deployed. OSINT then reported that massive nighttime protests in Tehran set cars and buildings ablaze as Iran's government plunges the country into a total internet blackout, which I had already mentioned. It had started a few days earlier, although they continually were making it and snuffing out more and more of the activity so that effectively no video or pictures were getting out regarding the protests, rather. Visegrad then came out with a report stating that the regime security forces have practically lost control of Iran's capital city of Tehran, the second largest city, Mashhad, and the fifth largest city, Shiraz. The Iranian anti-regime protesters had burned down the city hall of Iran's fourth largest city, Karaj. Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi then arrived in Lebanon, but left Beirut earlier than planned. The exact same day that he arrived in Lebanon, he returned to Iran. He was scheduled to visit Lebanon's presidential palace, but he left nearly immediately following a renewed Israeli bombing campaign in Lebanon against Hezbollah forces, which, again, Iran upholds. And this really sort of gives you the bigger picture as to everything happening here. Although Israel is bombing Lebanon, it really has to do with the bigger picture of Iran, and simultaneously in Syria, there's all kinds of different tribal factions in Syria that are currently infighting and have been for a long time. But the Israeli and American government have propped up the newest government leader in Syria and have systematically been giving him support to help overthrow other factions that are anti-Israel, or more anti-Israel than he is, perhaps, in order to further secure their border. In fact, I did a report on this a few months ago where in Syria there were, I'm trying to think of the name of them, Druze separatists. They were infighting with the Syrian democratic forces, which are not a part of the Syrian government forces. They were fighting with them, and when this happened, Druze separatists have had a long-standing relation with Israel, although they're not allies per se. There are a ton of Druze separatists who currently live in Israel. When this happened, Israel opened up their border completely to armed factions within Israel to go across the border into Syria and help the Druze in fighting back the Syrian democratic forces. And I say that just to sort of give you an idea as to how much this is so much of a larger play in securing Israel's borders. Whether it be in Iran, which is quite a bit away, or whether it be in the actual surrounding states of Syria or Lebanon. Visegrad then reported that in Shiraz, southern Iran, a bank branch was set on fire. And Reza Pahlavi, again the son of the Shah, the former Shah, came out in another statement stating that, quote, "I call on workers and employees in key sectors of the economy, especially transportation, oil and gas, and energy, to begin a nationwide strike. I also ask all of you to take to the streets from 6 p.m. on Saturday and Sunday, pour out to the streets with national flags, images, symbols, and reclaim public spaces as your own. Our goal is no longer merely to take to the streets. The goal is to prepare to seize city centers and hold them. I too am preparing to return to the homeland so that at the moment of victory of our national revolution, I can stand beside you, the great nation of Iran. I believe that day is very near. January 11th now. This is 2 days ago. Visegrad reports that a heavy U.S. military airlift into the Middle East is currently taking place. Israel has decided not to use bombs and missiles against Hezbollah, prioritizing building up an arsenal for Iran if needed. Khamenei then ordered raising the alert level in the country to the highest, and Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan said that Mossad is interfering in protests in Iran, which, again, I had stated earlier in this discussion that Mossad was reported as interfering in these protests as early as 10 days before this report even came out. Israeli Channel 12 then said that Israel estimates that Trump will eventually carry out the threat against Iran. Iranian opposition figures and sources stated, quote, "People can hold out for at most 2 more nights. If external aid is coming, it must come now." Rerum Novarum then reported that an Iranian commander of a missile unit in the Kashan County, Isfahan province of central Iran had been assassinated in a drone strike. So, this makes me think that we're almost certainly going to eventually carry out these threats. If the United States is to strike, whether it be the regime forces that are executing these protesters, or if it's the Iranian government itself and the government officials that are around Khamenei, that Israel is potentially preparing for this ahead of time because of the missile exchange that we saw the last time that we had bombed their nuclear facilities. They're preparing for this in advance by helping coordinate the assassination of their commander of a missile unit in Kashan County, Isfahan. Isfahan, again, is where one of the nuclear facilities was that we struck the last time that we ramped up this entire process. Visegrad then reported that the IRGC colonel Mahdi Rahimi had been killed by anti-regime protesters. He was responsible for IRGC troops shooting and killing around 10 protesters on January 3rd. Iranian state-affiliated Tasnim News said that at least 114 members of the country's security forces have died in the wave of protests. The Associated Press then came out with a report, and this is going to be all over the place, and quite frankly, no one knows for sure what the numbers are. But the confirmed death toll so far from the nationwide protests in Iran has rose to 636, noting that the real toll is likely significantly higher. Iranian opposition sources have reported figures ranging between 1 and 3,000. Even today, I saw figures as high as 10,000, which I think is, quite frankly, reaching. But it could be the case. However, with those numbers, those extremely dramatic numbers coming from opposition forces within the Iranian government, or sorry, not within the Iranian government, but within Iran, I think that we have to take that with a grain of salt because it is in their interest to make the numbers seem much larger than they potentially are. Activists also added that over 10,600 people have been detained, and this is a huge problem, specifically relating to what I'm about to discuss, because the regime, Khamenei specifically, has stated that all 10,600 people who have been detained will face public executions. Bloomberg reported that Trump is seriously considering issuing an authorization to launch an attack on Iran. Speaker of the Iranian parliament, Mohammed Bagher, I can't pronounce the last name, said, quote, "If the United States of America carries out a military attack, both Israel and the United States military and naval transport centers will become legitimate targets for us." And this, as I stated earlier, sort of plays into why I think that it is more than likely that Israeli or American intelligence played a part in the killing of their Isfahan missile commander, because if we do carry out these strikes, which Israel believes that we will, Iran is going to use their missiles to target, as I just said, Israeli and U.S. military and naval transport centers. Fox News then reported that, quote, Iran requested assistance from Iraqi militias, including certain Hezbollah factions within the nation, to suppress the wave of protests. Israeli Minister of Transport and Road Safety said, quote, the alert level in the Israeli Airport Authority has been raised. Visegrad then reported that Ukraine's military intelligence agency is likely considering transferring drone warfare know-how to a few carefully chosen leaders in Iran's protest movement in response to the Shahed drone tech that the Islamic regime transferred to Russia. Protesters were then filmed marking the homes of government officials with spray paint, which, although they haven't carried out any further assassinations as far as I know, is pretty significant given the assassinations that have already been carried out that we do know of. Pardon me. All this talking is just killing my throat. I was hoping to potentially cover Venezuela, but all of this talking is making me realize that I don't have it in me to do another hour show. So potentially I'll get to that tomorrow or the day after. Continuing now. January 13th, this is yesterday. Despite regime promises to restore connectivity, the internet blackout has now been ongoing for more than 100 hours, with the only notable connectivity being Starlink, which has actively been sabotaged by the Iranian government. Since the start of the protests, the rial has lost nearly 95% of its value. The rial, by the way, which is the Iranian national currency. It has lost 95% of its value in the Forex exchange relative to currencies such as the USD and Euro. Prior to the protests, the rial was already ranked among the globe's most fragile currencies, battered by sanctions, soaring inflation, and economic mismanagement, which plays into what I had discussed earlier regarding why the Iranian government was only able to make the offer of $7 per person per month in order to sort of quell these initial protests. And there has been some reports that I've seen, although I don't know the exact legitimacy of them, stating that it is possible that following further sanctions, which I will discuss in a moment, that we will completely bankrupt Iran within the following days, weeks, or months, given the rial's loss of value and the already battered economy. Axios then reported that Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi reached out to the White House envoy Steve Witkoff over the weekend amid President Trump's threats of military force against the regime in support of the recent protests. The outreach seemed to be an effort by Iran to de-escalate with the U.S., or at least buy more time before Trump orders any action to further weaken the regime. Araghchi and Witkoff have discussed potentially holding a meeting in the coming days. Trump had announced that that meeting was confirmed, and while it may have been, I've seen conflicting reports on that, so take that with a grain of salt. Israeli hospitals are ordered to prepare for an immediate shift to emergency operations as a precaution amid rising tensions with Iran and concerns over possible escalation. Iranian diplomats are now prohibited from entering the European Parliament. The U.S. State Department said, quote, President Trump is considering a series of strong options regarding Iran. Al Jazeera, citing a U.S. official, said that, quote, U.S. forces in the Middle East are ready for any emergency, any mission, and to defend themselves and our interests. The planning of U.S. military options against Iran has reached advanced stages. Reza Pahlavi then said he is expected to meet with Trump at Mar-a-Lago to discuss further Iranian actions. And the U.S. came out stating that it will respond to Iran's offer to negotiate by presenting several preconditions. Firstly, an end to the suppression of protests, a release of all detainees and protesters, the handover of all enriched uranium, the complete halting of uranium enrichment in Iran, the cessation of Iran's long-range ballistic missile program, and lastly, ending Iran's support for proxy groups in the region. Okay. Just a second. Given what we know regarding Iran's actions in the past and present, these preconditions are almost certainly not going to be met. So we'll start with the first one, an end to the suppression of the protests. They have been burning government buildings. They have been carrying out assassinations on government officials. They've been burning down bank branches. They've completely closed gold markets. They've destroyed the national currency. The regime has no choice but to suppress these protests. And they're growing weaker and weaker and becoming less able to do so. But their only option for their current government's survival is to snuff these out. Secondly, the release of all detainees and protesters. Khomeini has already stated that he is going to start carrying out live executions of these protesters, all 10,600 of them, and he is already on schedule to start doing so within, I believe, the next 36 hours. Next, the handover of all enriched uranium. This is something that America and Israel wanted when we had last bombed their nuclear facilities, something that they refused to do, and still up until this point have refused to do. So the idea that they are going to do it now seems ridiculous to me, because they have persisted in a continuous state of turmoil regardless of any sanctions or any other actions that the U.S. and Israelis have implemented on them, and have continuously refused to give up their enriched uranium regardless. The complete halting of uranium enrichment in Iran. It is within Iran's best interests to continue to enrich uranium because, if need be, they feel as though a nuclear deterrent is their only true deterrent against Israeli and U.S. aggression if we were to do something equating to a ground invasion of Iran. A cessation of Iran's long-range ballistic missile program. Again, they feel as though they need these long-range missiles in order to counter Israeli and American progression. Without them, if we are to do any form of further military action against their leaders, they will have no way of striking back against us. They will be just stuck there flailing and be subject to American and Israel's whims. And then lastly, ending of Iran's support for proxy groups in the region. Proxy groups are their only way within the last few decades of projecting power in the region, and without them, Iran will effectively fall within a matter of months if they do not continue to uphold them. All of this leads me to believe that these preconditions, which we are presenting as a diplomatic workaround, a reasonable diplomatic workaround, are unreasonable in the eyes of the Iranian government, and B, will ultimately lead to further military aggression by the U.S. and Israel. Okay. Now, sorry, take one last drink here. The U.S. government came out with a reported list of potential intervention options. Firstly, ordering military strikes on regime sites. Secondly, launching cyber attacks, which we've already reported had happened, although we don't know whether that was the Israelis or Americans that did that. Thirdly, approving of new sanctions, which has happened, and I will discuss here in a minute. And fourthly, boosting anti-regime accounts online, which it is my belief, although major news outlets have not been covering this to the degree that I believe they should be, because it is such a major update in the Middle East, I believe that we have already been boosting anti-regime accounts online, specifically on platforms such as X, and given Elon's recent discussions with Trump to continue to provide Starlink access and even Starlink terminals to people within Iran, I believe that it would only make sense that he's simultaneously boosting anti-regime accounts throughout the last few weeks of these protests and helping ramp them up. Okay. Trump then said, again, this is yesterday, quote, effective immediately, any country doing business with the Islamic Republic of Iran will pay a 25% tariff on any and all business being done with the United States of America. This order is final and conclusive. And this directly affects Iran's two largest, well, really its largest supporter, which is China. Although Russia supplies arguably the same amount of military equipment to Iran as China does, China is a major, what's the word I'm looking for? It consumes tons and tons of oil. It's a major importer of oil. A lot of that oil is Iranian. And if we are going to tack on a 25% tariff to any country doing business, that is going to affect China heavily. Now, because of the current Ukrainian conflict, there's next to no business being done between Russia and the United States. So it doesn't affect them so much. But with their, you could argue, their largest oil importer and their largest military equipment exporter being China, getting a 25% tariff tacked on to, I believe that the tariffs we'd already negotiated, Trump and Xi Jinping had already negotiated, and into the initial tariffs. If we are going to ramp up tariffs against China again, this will heavily disrupt the flow of oil and arms to and from Iran and effectively bankrupt them and leave them unable to resupply arms in the event of another military exchange. The U.S. virtual embassy in Tehran then stated that U.S. citizens should leave Iran now. Videos are still surfacing via Starlink showing mass protests continuing in Tehran. And then today, finally, I did not think this podcast was going to take this long. Just a little stretch left and we're going to be at the end of this. Pardon me. Today, the Wall Street Journal reported that Iran is actively hunting down people using Starlink and confiscating terminals, all while jamming the internet satellite signals. The Wall Street Journal also reported that aides led by Vice President J.D. Vance are advocating for diplomacy with the Islamic regime as a first step, with Vance publicly suggesting that a real negotiation on Iran's nuclear program could be the smartest path forward. This was rather interesting to me because of all of Trump's recent talk of supporting democracy in Iran, supporting potential regime change. This sort of points to the Zionist factions within the Trump administration and Trump himself capitulating to some degree to Israel's initial demands to simply deplete Iran's enriched uranium stockpiles, rather than going forward with regime change that the protesters are calling for. And there's a list of reasons why you can make the argument that they should or should not do that. If we do go for regime change in Iran, which a lot of Israeli components would argue that we should, if we are to do that, it could completely plunge Iran into a state of civil war. Although I've talked a lot about the anti-regime protests in the last few weeks, there have been recent developments, a lot of which has been propagandized by the Iranian government. There have been protests, counter-protests, that are pro-regime in Iran that have not been to the same degree as the anti-regime protests, but nevertheless shown that there is still a lot of internal support for the Ayatollah. And so, if we are to push for total regime change, it could lead to a civil war that, quite frankly, we don't know what the end game there would be. And it could be something that continually spirals out of control and requires further U.S. involvement in the region. Okay. Visegrad then came out with a report stating that Iran state television aired footage of the bodies of killed protesters and the bullets that killed them. Iranian propagandists claimed that the victims were allegedly killed by trained terrorists, asserting that these individuals were among the protesters themselves. So, they're claiming that Iranian state television was claiming that all of the videos that we saw of regime forces killing the people were actually terrorist cells that were disguising themselves as regime forces, which is crazy considering they only started the killing they started the mass killing rather, directly after they cut off the internet in order to stop the videos of the mass killings from getting out to the outside world. The Iraqi Hezbollah militia, okay. I didn't realize that I had all of this here. The Iraqi Hezbollah militia is threatening the U.S., stating, quote, "An American war against Iran is not a picnic, but a fire, which once ignited will be extinguished." And I just included that in there to state that although there are Kurdish forces within Iraq that have been fighting against the Iranian regime, there are also other forces in Iraq that are pro-Iranian regime, and I included this to sort of paint the bigger picture that, again, if the Ayatollah is overthrown and a civil war does commence within Iran, it could spread really to a lot of other regions. It could spread to Iraq, it could spread to Afghanistan. We don't know how big and bad it could get. If Iran is completely overthrown, it's also going to threaten Turkey to a large degree. And while Turkey is far more stable than Iran, if the entire Middle Eastern region is to dissolve into a series of civil war which other regions such as Lebanon and Syria are already experiencing, we could see easily the starting of a much, much larger conflict, the likes of which we can't really even fathom at the moment. And then lastly here, Lebanese Foreign Minister Youssef Reggie said, "Lebanon has agreed to conditions according to which, as long as Hezbollah has not completely disarmed, Israel has the right to continue attacking in Lebanon." And I don't really know why I included that now that I look at it, but nevertheless, it is sort of playing into the bigger picture of Israel and America attacking Hezbollah forces in the region and trying to, again, secure Israel's borders. Okay. Whew! I think that was the most talking that I've done in months. Now that that's said and done, I will potentially either tomorrow or the day after be doing an episode on Venezuela, which, like I said, I wanted to do today, but I don't have it in me, especially not after that. I don't know how long that episode just lasted, but I'm guessing an hour. Here, let me see if I can check. 56 minutes, whatever. That's plenty for me today. I've had enough. I don't have enough water in my... Oh, you can't even see that on the green screen. I don't have enough water to continue talking without my voice going out, so we're just going to call it quits and then pick it back up on Venezuela and really the broader picture as to how our current war in Venezuela is a larger part of Israeli and American foreign diplomacy that has been long-standing and how it all ties together. So if you're interested in that, please come back. Please subscribe so that you can see my next episode where I discuss all of this. And if you like this episode, please leave a comment, or even better yet, subscribe so that you can continue seeing episodes like this. I've made this promise a ton of times, but I truly, truly do mean it. I will be doing multiple episodes a week from now on. I don't know how many, but hopefully 3 to 4 episodes per week from now until at least June. So if this is something that you're interested in, please stick around. Hopefully I have a lot more good stuff to come. And thank you for watching, guys. I appreciate it a lot. This is GeoIntel. My name is Cody Jordan. I'll see you later, guys. Peace.